Bananas get dismissed pretty often as just sugar and starch. Cheap, convenient, and too basic to matter, compared to trendier superfoods with flashier marketing. That reputation isn't really fair, and it's worth taking a closer look at why. Bananas are a genuinely nutrient-dense, extensively studied food, and several of their properties become particularly relevant as people age, touching on gut health, blood pressure regulation, blood sugar control, cognitive function, inflammation, and muscle and bone maintenance. None of this makes a banana miraculous, and it's worth being honest about the size of these effects rather than overselling them. But there's genuine substance behind the reputation, once you look past the oversimplified, too sugary dismissal. Gut health and digestion. Digestive function tends to change with age in ways that don't get discussed as often as they probably should. Gut motility, essentially how efficiently the muscles of your digestive tract move food and waste along, tends to slow over time, and this contributes to a cluster of common complaints: constipation, bloating, and in some cases, reduced efficiency of nutrient absorption. The gut also plays a role well beyond digestion itself. It's now understood to be closely connected to immune function and, through what researchers call the gut-brain axis, to mood and cognitive health as well. A medium banana provides roughly 3 grams of fiber, split between 2 distinct types that work in complementary ways. Insoluble fiber adds bulk and helps move waste through the colon more efficiently, reducing transit time. Soluble fiber, on the other hand, absorbs water and forms a gel-like substance in the digestive tract, which slows the absorption of sugar and cholesterol, a mechanism relevant to both blood sugar control and cardiovascular health, which we'll come back to. There's a second, somewhat less well-known component worth understanding: resistant starch. This is most abundant in bananas that are still slightly green at the tips. As bananas ripen, resistant starch gradually converts to regular digestible starch and sugar, which is part of why a very ripe banana tastes sweeter, and a green-tinged one tastes starchier. Resistant starch, true to its name, resists digestion by enzymes in the small intestine, meaning it travels largely intact to the colon. Once there, it becomes a food source for beneficial gut bacteria, a process called fermentation, which produces several beneficial byproducts, more on one of these, butyrate, in the inflammation section below. This matters more than it might initially seem, because gut microbiome diversity, essentially how many different beneficial bacterial species are present and thriving, tends to decline with age, and research has associated lower microbiome diversity with higher markers of frailty, inflammation, and even cognitive decline in older adults. Feeding beneficial bacteria with resistant starch is one dietary lever available to help support that diversity. There's also a specific practical scenario where this matters even more: after a course of antibiotics. Antibiotics, by design, kill bacteria broadly, including much of the beneficial bacterial population in the gut alongside whatever pathogen they were targeting. Resistant starch, by providing fuel for the surviving beneficial bacteria, can support faster repopulation of a healthy gut microbiome during recovery. Practical takeaway: a slightly green-tipped banana with breakfast paired with plain yogurt, which contributes live bacterial cultures of its own, is a reasonable, low-effort way to combine fiber, resistant starch, and probiotics in a single sitting. And it's a particularly good habit to lean into if you're recovering from a course of antibiotics. Potassium, blood pressure, and heart rhythm. A medium banana contains roughly 420 milligrams of potassium, a genuinely meaningful contribution given that a substantial proportion of adults, older adults especially, fall short of recommended potassium intake. Potassium is an electrolyte, meaning it carries electrical charge, and it plays a direct, essential role in the electrical signaling that governs muscle contraction throughout the body, including, critically, the rhythmic contraction of the heart. Every heartbeat depends on a precisely regulated exchange of potassium and sodium across heart muscle cell membranes. When potassium levels drop too low, that electrical signaling becomes less stable, and the risk of abnormal heart rhythms increases. This includes atrial fibrillation, the most common heart rhythm disorder in older adults, along with broader increases in cardiovascular risk. This connection has real backing in large-scale research. A frequently cited long-term study from the Harvard T.H. Chan School of Public Health, following more than 100,000 adults over multiple decades, found that people with higher intake of potassium-rich foods had meaningfully lower rates of cardiovascular death compared to those with lower potassium intake. it's worth being precise about how to interpret findings like this. This is an observational, population-level association, meaning it reflects a broader dietary and lifestyle pattern, rather than proof that potassium alone, in isolation, drives the reduction in risk. People who eat more potassium-rich whole foods like bananas, leafy greens, and legumes also tend, on average, to have generally healthier dietary patterns overall. That doesn't make the finding meaningless. It's a genuinely useful signal, but it's a different, more modest claim than eating a banana daily reduces your risk of cardiovascular death by a specific percentage. Potassium's relevance extends beyond the heart into muscular function more broadly. Age-related muscle loss, known as sarcopenia, is a well-documented phenomenon. Many adults lose a meaningful percentage of muscle mass per year after age 65, with effects that ripple outward into metabolism, bone density, balance, and ultimately independence. Muscle cramping and reduced muscular endurance are commonly connected, at least in part, to potassium status, among other factors. Several converging factors make older adults particularly vulnerable to potassium insufficiency. Certain blood pressure medications, especially diuretics, increase potassium excretion through the kidneys. Aging kidneys themselves become somewhat less efficient at regulating potassium balance overall, and aging digestive systems can become less efficient at absorbing potassium and other minerals from food. Together, these factors make it easier to fall short, even with a reasonably balanced diet. This is part of why nutrition researchers often emphasize whole food potassium sources over supplements specifically. Potassium from foods like bananas comes packaged alongside a broader matrix of cofactors, fiber, magnesium, various plant compounds, that support its absorption and function in ways an isolated supplement doesn't fully replicate. Pairing a banana with a source of magnesium, such as a small serving of pumpkin seeds, is a reasonable way to support the combined mineral balance relevant to both muscle and cardiovascular function, since magnesium plays a role in keeping potassium appropriately distributed inside versus outside cells. An important caution: more potassium is not automatically better, particularly for people with kidney disease or those taking medications that raise potassium levels. Certain blood pressure medications work in the opposite direction from diuretics, increasing rather than decreasing potassium retention. For those individuals, excess dietary potassium can become dangerous rather than beneficial. This is a case where individual medical guidance should take precedence over general dietary advice. Brain function and mood. The brain is a remarkably energy-intensive organ. It accounts for only about 2% of body weight, but consumes roughly 20% of the body's energy at rest. There's research suggesting that after about age 60, the brain's efficiency at using glucose, its primary fuel source, can decline, a phenomenon sometimes described in research contexts as cerebral insulin resistance, where brain cells become somewhat less responsive to insulin's role in facilitating glucose uptake, even when blood sugar levels themselves remain normal. Over time, this is thought to contribute to some of the cognitive fog, memory lapses, and mental fatigue that become more common with age. Bananas provide a meaningful amount of vitamin B6, pyridoxine, often cited as covering roughly 20 to 25% of the recommended daily intake for older adults in a single fruit. B6's relevance to brain function comes from its role as an essential cofactor in synthesizing several key neurotransmitters: serotonin, dopamine, and GABA. These are the chemical messengers that allow neurons to communicate. Serotonin plays a central role in mood regulation and sleep, dopamine in motivation and movement coordination, and GABA in calming and regulating nervous system activity. Without adequate B6, the synthesis of these neurotransmitters can become less efficient. Some research, including studies published in journals like the American Journal of Clinical Nutrition, has found associations between higher B6 intake or blood levels and better performance on tests of memory, processing speed, and executive function among older adults. As with the potassium research above, it's worth flagging that this kind of nutritional epidemiology reflects associations within broader dietary patterns, and isolating B6's specific independent contribution is genuinely difficult. But the biological mechanism, B6 as an essential cofactor for neurotransmitter synthesis, is well established, which lends the association more plausibility than a purely coincidental correlation would carry. Bananas also contain a modest amount of tryptophan, an amino acid that serves as a precursor for serotonin synthesis. This is part of the reasoning behind the popular idea that a banana eaten in the afternoon or evening can have a mildly calming effect and support better sleep. It's worth calibrating expectations here. The tryptophan content of a banana is fairly modest, and a wide range of factors influence sleep quality far more substantially. That said, as one small food-based contributor to an evening routine oriented around calm and sleep support, it's a reasonable and low-risk choice, particularly compared to relying on sleep medications. Sleep architecture itself changes with age. Particularly past 75, deep, restorative sleep tends to become shorter and more fragmented, which has downstream effects on memory consolidation, immune function, and cardiovascular health. Supporting natural serotonin production through diet, alongside other established sleep hygiene practices, is a reasonable, non-pharmaceutical piece of that picture. Some research has also looked at pairing tryptophan-containing foods with L-theanine, found in green tea, which has its own studied calming properties, though this specific combination is a less thoroughly established area than the individual components. Inflammation: chronic, low-grade inflammation, sometimes distinguished from acute short-term inflammation, like what occurs around an injury, is increasingly recognized in aging research as a contributor to a remarkably wide range of age-related conditions: arthritis, cardiovascular disease, cognitive decline, type 2 diabetes, and others. Researchers at institutions studying the biology of aging, including the Buck Institute for Research on Aging, have used the term inflammaging to describe this phenomenon, a persistent, low-level activation of the immune system that tends to increase with age, even without an identifiable acute threat like an infection. This connects back to the resistant starch discussed earlier in a specific and genuinely well-studied way. When gut bacteria ferment resistant starch, one of the primary byproducts is butyrate, a short-chain fatty acid with well-documented anti-inflammatory properties. Mechanistically, butyrate has been shown to inhibit a signaling pathway called NF-kappa B, which functions as a kind of master switch controlling the expression of numerous inflammation-related genes. When NF-kappa B activity goes unchecked, it tends to drive up expression of a broad range of pro-inflammatory genes. Human studies have found associations between higher butyrate levels, typically inferred from higher intake of fermentable fiber sources like resistant starch, and lower levels of C-reactive protein, the standard blood marker used clinically to assess systemic inflammation. Bananas also contain some antioxidant compounds relevant to this picture, including a compound called dopamine. Worth clarifying immediately that this is not the same as the dopamine functioning as a neurotransmitter in the brain. In the context of banana chemistry, this refers to a related molecule that functions as an antioxidant, helping to neutralize free radicals and reduce oxidative damage, including oxidative damage to circulating cholesterol, a process implicated in the buildup of arterial plaque. Some research comparing the antioxidant capacity of bananas to more widely marketed superfoods has found bananas to be a genuinely competitive source, which runs somewhat counter to their reputation as a nutritionally unremarkable fruit. Ginger is sometimes paired with bananas specifically for this purpose. Ginger contains compounds called gingerols and shogales, both studied for anti-inflammatory properties through mechanisms somewhat distinct from butyrate's NF-kappa B inhibition, meaning the combination could plausibly address inflammation through more than one pathway simultaneously, though this specific combination hasn't been as rigorously studied as the individual components. Structure: blood sugar, more nuanced than the bananas spike your blood sugar assumption. There's a common and understandable assumption that bananas, being relatively sweet and starchy, are a food to avoid or limit if you're managing blood sugar. The fuller picture is more favorable and more nuanced than that assumption suggests. Glycemic index, GI, measures how quickly a food raises blood sugar relative to pure glucose. A ripe banana has a GI of around 51, which places it solidly in the low to medium range, notably lower than white bread, white rice, and many commercially marketed heart-healthy breakfast cereals. But GI alone can be a somewhat misleading metric on its own, because it doesn't account for the actual quantity of carbohydrate in a typical serving. That's where glycemic load, GL, becomes more useful. It factors in both the GI and the actual carbohydrate content per serving. A medium banana has a glycemic load of roughly 11, which falls in a moderate, generally manageable range for most adults, including many people managing prediabetes, particularly when eaten as part of a balanced meal rather than in isolation on an empty stomach. The resistant starch content of underripe bananas shifts this picture further in a favorable direction. Because resistant starch isn't broken down into absorbable sugar in the small intestine the way regular starch is, it doesn't trigger the same insulin release or blood sugar rise. Some research has found that regular resistant starch intake improves insulin sensitivity over a period of several weeks in adults with metabolic syndrome, a genuinely meaningful finding, since declining insulin sensitivity is a core feature of the progression toward type 2 diabetes. This matters particularly for older adults, because insulin sensitivity tends to decline with age for several converging reasons. Reduced muscle mass, muscle tissue is a major site of glucose uptake and storage, reduced physical activity, mitochondrial changes affecting cellular energy metabolism, and chronic low-grade inflammation, tying back to the previous section. This creates something of a self-reinforcing cycle. Less muscle means less efficient glucose storage, which places more demand on the pancreas to produce insulin, which over time can contribute to further metabolic strain. Pairing a banana, particularly a slightly underripe one, with a source of protein can meaningfully interrupt part of that cycle. Protein and fiber both slow gastric emptying, the rate at which food moves from the stomach into the small intestine, which in turn flattens the resulting blood sugar curve after a meal. Some research, including studies published in journals like Diabetes Care, has found that combining resistant starch with lean protein can measurably reduce the post-meal blood glucose rise compared to consuming carbohydrate-containing foods without that pairing. Practical takeaway: pairing a banana with protein or healthy fat, almond butter, a handful of mixed nuts, or hard-boiled eggs is a reasonable strategy for slowing sugar absorption, improving satiety, and reducing the likelihood of overeating later. Choosing a slightly underripe banana and eating it as part of a morning meal, rather than alone on an empty stomach, further supports this effect. That said, anyone actively managing diabetes or prediabetes should coordinate specific dietary strategies with their doctor or a registered dietitian. General guidance like this is a reasonable starting framework, not a substitute for individualized medical advice. Muscle and bone maintenance. This may be the most underappreciated angle of banana nutrition, and it's worth spending real time on the underlying mechanism because it connects several nutrients in a genuinely interesting way. A banana provides a modest but meaningful amount of magnesium, roughly 32 milligrams. On its own, that number doesn't sound particularly impressive, but its significance becomes clearer once you understand magnesium's role at the cellular level, especially in the context of a phenomenon called anabolic resistance. Anabolic resistance refers to a well-documented, age-related decline in the body's ability to build and repair muscle tissue in response to protein intake and resistance exercise. In a younger adult, eating protein triggers a fairly robust muscle protein synthesis response. After roughly age 65, that response becomes measurably blunted. Some research suggests by somewhere in the range of 30 to 40%, meaning older adults generally need more protein and more consistent resistance exercise to achieve a comparable muscle-preserving effect to what a younger adult gets more easily. Magnesium is directly relevant here because it functions as a required cofactor in over 300 distinct enzymatic reactions throughout the body, several of which are central to muscle maintenance specifically. It's needed for activating IGF-1, one of the body's primary muscle-building hormonal signals. It's required for the proper function of ribosomes, the cellular machinery responsible for actually assembling proteins from amino acids. And it's essential for ATP production, ATP being the fundamental energy currency that every cell, including muscle cells, relies on to perform any function at all, from contraction to repair to growth. Without adequate magnesium, each of these processes becomes less efficient, which compounds the challenge already posed by age-related anabolic resistance. Observational research following large cohorts of older adults has found associations between higher magnesium intake and better outcomes across several markers relevant to functional independence: grip strength, walking speed, lower extremity performance, and bone mineral density. Bone density decline is a particularly important piece of this picture. Many women experience bone density loss of roughly 1 to 2% per year after menopause, and fracture risk, closely tied to bone density, is a leading cause of lost independence in older adults. What makes bananas a particularly well-designed food for this purpose, beyond magnesium content alone, is the broader nutritional package they provide. Vitamin B6, also present in bananas, supports magnesium absorption across the gut wall. And bananas contain fructooligosaccharides, a type of prebiotic fiber that helps lower colonic pH in ways that further support mineral absorption, including both magnesium and calcium. In other words, banana magnesium isn't just present in isolation. It arrives in a food matrix that supports its own absorption, something that isolated supplements don't naturally replicate. It's worth being direct about the limits of this, though. Magnesium and B6 intake are supporting factors, not primary drivers, of muscle and bone preservation. The single most well-established, powerful intervention for preserving muscle mass and bone density with age remains regular resistance exercise, combined with adequate overall protein intake. A banana's nutritional contribution is real and worth taking seriously, but it functions best as a complement to that foundation, not a substitute for it. Pairing a banana with a protein source like wild salmon or sardines, which also provide omega-3 fatty acids studied for their own anti-inflammatory effects, is a reasonable way to combine several of these supportive factors in one meal. The honest summary: none of this makes a banana a cure for anything, and it's worth staying skeptical of any framing that positions a single food as transformative on its own. That kind of claim rarely survives close scrutiny, regardless of which food is being discussed. What the evidence actually supports is more modest and arguably more useful precisely because it's realistic. Bananas are a genuinely nutrient-dense, affordable, widely available food that contributes meaningfully to fiber intake, potassium status, vitamin B6, and magnesium intake, and, specifically, through resistant starch when the banana is slightly underripe, gut health, and markers of systemic inflammation. That's a solid, evidence-supported case for making bananas a regular part of your diet, without needing to inflate what any single food can realistically accomplish. As with most nutrition topics, individual circumstances matter. If you're managing a specific condition like kidney disease or diabetes, or take medications that affect potassium levels, it's genuinely worth checking with your doctor or a registered dietitian about how bananas specifically fit into your situation, rather than applying general dietary advice uniformly to every individual case.